Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for a West Coast friendly webinar as part of FairVote's ongoing series of conversations on the future of American elections. It is lunchtime on the West Coast, happy hour on the East Coast. I think your panel has not been indulging yet, but by the end of this, you never know. This is democracy in America conversation, right? There is indeed not a more timely topic. As the seminars have been going on, we've been talking with some of the most visionary thinkers in the electoral reform space about how we create the kind of democracy that lives up to our highest ideals and helps allow for the kinds of politics and leaderships we need during this especially challenging moment. Today's conversation promises to be yet another exceptional one. We have three of the top minds on this issue with us today, experts who have thought deeply about problems of representation and the toxicity of gerrymandering over many years. I am David Daley, a senior fellow at FairVote, the author of two books on partisan gerrymandering and electoral reform, Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which told the story of the last redistricting cycle, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. I'll be moderating this panel, but we want you to be involved today. I'll pose the first couple rounds of questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. If you have questions you would like to ask, please use the Q&A and chat functions below. You're all experts in this by now. Go ahead, leave those there at any time. Our FairVote team is monitoring those fields throughout the conversation. As far as background for what we'll be talking about, as you certainly know if you are here, we redraw every congressional and state legislative district in the nation after the census to account for population shifts. In most states, it's state legislatures that control this process. Politicians being politicians, they've long found ways to manipulate this process that's supposed to be about equal representation into one that helps lock themselves and their party into power. Indeed, it's never been worse than it is right now. These maps are the building blocks of our democracy. They will define our politics for the next decade. So what can we expect as this process begins anew? Who will control it? What might create a better process? Let me introduce this terrific panel. Carolyn Fiddler is Communications Director for Daily Kos and is the nation's foremost expert in state politics. She writes an amazing newsletter that you must sign up for. It's called This Week in State House Action, provides updates on state politics to thousands of reporters and political operatives and observers every week. She's a veteran of Virginia politics with almost 2 decades of experience in state house machinations. Has spent her professional life working for various Democratic and progressive organizations. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Arkansas, received her JD from the College of William and Mary, from a small town in Virginia you've never heard of, and her comic book collection is probably bigger than yours. Michael Latner is professor of political science at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo, and senior fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists Center for Science and Democracy. The Union of Concerned Scientists works for strong, independent public science, a robust, transparent democracy, justice for overburdened communities, and the effective use of science in making policy that serves the common good. His most recent book, with Alex Kina, Anthony McGann, and Charles Anthony Smith, is Gerrymandering the States, Partisanship, Race, and the Transformation of American Federalism. It is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. It is a follow-up to this, Gerrymandering in America, which came out about the same month as Rat Effed, and which is absolutely indispensable. And Carlos Ochoa is the Communications Director for More Equitable Democracy. More Equitable Democracy is a racial justice organization led by people of color to serve as a nonprofit intermediary that works with communities of color to advance electoral system reforms that increase representation for underrepresented communities. Carlos approaches his work through narrative, systems, and anthropological theories. Carlos uses these tools to help communicate the current crises of belonging in governance and the opportunities for communities of color to advocate for their own liberation. Carlos holds a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Arkansas. So I should not be talking about that basketball game last night with 2 people on this panel. I'm very sorry. It was a close one. It was a great year. Anyway, moving right along. Welcome, everybody. Carolyn, I want to start with you. Could you define the state of play for us as we head into this contentious process Republicans dominated redistricting in this last decade. They control the maps in just about every swing state: North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, Texas, Ohio, Michigan. Have Democrats even the playing field at all? What's the overall balance of power? Where will the most important battles be? Where has power shifted? Where might reforms create a fairer process? Go.
Yeah, just a few points there. The state of play is crap for people who care about progressive policies, electing Democrats, or even just fair vote shares. People's votes getting counted, Democrats' votes not being wasted. Things aren't looking good. I was actually working in state politics in 2010, and that election night in 2010 remains the longest of my life. But election night 2020 gave it a run for its money, because things aren't really much better for Democrats this time around than they were a decade ago, unfortunately. Republicans will control, at least at the congressional level, about the drawing of about 4 times as many congressional seats as Democrats will control. But there are a few places where things moved in favor of fairness. Pennsylvania, we have a Democratic governor there and a Democratic majority state Supreme Court, which will definitely help protect voters and Democrats from GOP gerrymandering there. We also have a Democratic governor in Wisconsin, which is also a great example of an extreme GOP gerrymander right now. But the Republicans who are in power there are very creative historically, and they are looking for ways to possibly cut the governor out of the process there, the way that Republicans did in North Carolina a decade or so ago. By the way, Democratic governor there, doesn't matter, has 0 say in the redistricting process. So Republicans there will continue to dominate that, and it will be a very, very ugly map. In Michigan, we have a Democratic governor, but we also have a citizen-passed bipartisan redistricting commission there. So things are lined up to be less crappy in Michigan, which is good. But then you have a place like Iowa that offsets that. Republicans will completely control that process in Iowa for the first time, I think since modern redistricting became a thing. And they are poised to they don't even have to change any laws there, even though they could if they wanted to. They're just going to own that process and manipulate it to their own ends. And there's really nothing to stop them. And then you have a place like Arizona, where there is a ostensibly nonpartisan redistricting commission, but in terms of who's on that commission, the Republican governor has been gaming the heck out of that. So the nonpartisanness of that process is certainly somewhat in doubt at this point. And then you have a place like Virginia, where Democrats did take over state government over the past decade, and but also passed a nonpartisan citizens redistricting commission. So hopefully you won't have any sort of gerrymander there. But in terms of leveling the playing field, Republican drawn districts versus Democratic drawn districts, it's going to be so skewed in favor of Republicans again, that I think everyone needs to prepare for Democrats losing the U.S. House in 2022 and another long decade slog back to power for Democrats in state legislatures. It's the news is pretty much all bad. I'm sorry, I'm that guy.
That's often a role played by me. So I'm glad that the role of David Daley this evening will be played by Carolyn Fiddler. Michael, one of the key arguments in gerrymandering in America is that the U.S. Supreme Court opened the door for the kind of extreme gerrymanders of this last cycle by effectively declining to create any guardrails or standards in the much under-discussed 2004 Pennsylvania case, the Veith case, because if I try and say the defendant's name, I will botch that the way I always do. The court declined to get involved in restricting the most egregious partisan gerrymanders. It made clear that there would have to be a rather high bar set to spur the court's intervention. And in so doing, you and your co-authors argue it gave a green light to state lawmakers to maximize partisan advantage in 2011. And your research shows the maps from the 2010 cycle are 3 times as partisan as the maps from 2000. Well, let me play the role of Carolyn here for a second. The news now is even worse, right? In 2019, a case from North Carolina, Ochoa versus Common Cause, the Supreme Court called partisan gerrymandering a non-justiciable political issue, slammed the federal courthouses closed to these claims. So if Veith provided a green light, Ochoa seems to remove any speed limit at all. What will the impact of that decision be on the maps of this cycle? And if federal courts have been shuttered to these claims, are there other legal avenues that can be pursued by those interested in fairer maps, say in state courts?
There are some other avenues, and to Carolyn's point, there are a handful of Democratic governors now in some of these states, which sometimes matters, sometimes doesn't. But the news is not good, and moreover, even where there are avenues in the state courts, there aren't where we need them most often. So you certainly have state courts and state constitutions, as Pennsylvania showed, where there are free and fair elections clauses, and so that, or language comparable, to an equal protection clause. Litigation in those states can and has produced better maps, but again, the states that are really the worst, they need a free and fair elections clause, and they don't have one. Moreover, there's a bigger problem that we identified with relying too much on the courts to ensure fair representation. And that is that they're not really very good at it. And by that, I mean, we looked at all the state legislative maps that were drawn by court order and compared them to the previous maps that were struck down and those drawn by state legislatures and other processes like independent redistricting commissions. And what we found was that it's basically a crapshoot with the courts. Certainly you can get effective maps from court-appointed special masters. In particular, you look at the map that Nate Persily drew in Pennsylvania, the racial redistricting maps that Bernie Groffman drew in Virginia. But often the maps that are drawn can even be more biased than the ones that are struck down. We saw this in Texas, for example, where the maps looked at least as bad from a partisan bias perspective when they were struck down in the last redistricting cycle. And moreover, by virtue of the judicial process itself, courts tend to be incrementalist. They tend to prefer maps that minimize the number of districts that are going to be redrawn if they need to be redrawn. They tend to rely strongly on other criteria, oftentimes not even using partisan data in the process of drawing the map. So they're sort of mapping blind with regard to partisanship. And then, other criteria like protecting incumbents and requiring other districting criteria like compactness that can often minimize their capacity to address partisan bias directly. And so, there are efforts that citizens can use to try to get free and fair elections clauses in states that don't have them. That's a good idea where it will be effective. But as we've also seen in Michigan and Missouri, the parties and state legislatures fight back pretty vociferously against these efforts through litigation. So the court path is one that sort of accepts incrementalism as a way and really limits the capacity to address the worst partisan gerrymandering. Even if the courts can draw remedial maps, we're still not getting directly at the problem.
Carlos, the Rucho decision effectively found that federal courts can do nothing to stop a partisan gerrymander. But that's not the only 5-4 ruling in the last decade that could affect the maps that are drawn this cycle. In 2013, in the Shelby County case, the court eliminated the preclearance provisions from the Voting Rights Act. It means for the first time in the modern era, maps will be drawn without the full protections of the VRA. States with a history of racial discrimination will not have to get their maps pre-cleared before they become law. So there's now this opportunity for lawmakers who would once claim that they were packing voters of color in order to create majority-minority districts under the Voting Rights Act to now pack those voters and just say they're doing it because they're Democrats. Will the court's ruling on partisan gerrymanders undo protections against racial gerrymanders? And what do you expect in this first redistricting cycle without those full protections of the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, it looks like there's not going to be many protections, many safeguards at all against that practice. So it's going to be very bad. It's going to be very bad for communities of color. Like I said, there's not going to be any safeguards to really protect from the worst that is coming down the pipeline. And there's potential to further undermine the legal standards of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So it's just this continuous erosion of the VRA. Now, in some ways, it's kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid that needs to be ripped off anyway. It's painful now, but it does open up some opportunities. You know, these wounds open up some opportunities for asking ourselves, well, what does representation really look like? How do we create new electoral systems where people, whether they're a community of interest as the VRA defines them, whether they're communities of color, racial or ethnic minorities, young people, how do we find places of belonging in our local governance to address the issues of the future? And the future is already here, right? I mean, 2050 is not really that far away, and we're going to be reaching peak population near that time, which means peak energy consumption, peak food production, peak climate change, all these things. And so we need to understand, like, well, what does representation look like, and what is really the role of government? And if we kind of frame it like that, then we're able to understand that really people don't want single member districts. They want representation. Single member districts, it's a preference that's turned into a tradition. They are not a requirement for equitable representation. And I think that we'll talk a little bit about this later, but this idea that HR1, is it going to fix this problem? And I think that there's like some yes and no kind of there. And we probably need to touch on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act as well.
I think you're exactly right. And we will certainly get around to all of those topics, I think, in our second round of questioning. And I want to remind all of you watching that if you would like to have a question answered by this panel, just drop it in the chat or in the Q&A box. I see that there's a lot of terrific ones in there already. So we will go around one more time, and then we will begin to answer some of those. Carolyn, you watch state legislatures closer than just about anybody I know. What stories are you watching out there that perhaps we're not seeing? I mean, in the news today, we see that the chairman of the Independent Commission from Colorado turns out to be a voter fraud conspiracy theorist. You touched on what's happening in Arizona, in which that commission has already been gripped by partisan fervor. We can see that Democrats in New York are making some moves behind the scenes to perhaps ensure that the state legislature draws those lines rather than a commission, especially with the census information might not be out until August or September. It's messing up a lot of the timelines in states. What should we be watching for that perhaps we're not seeing? Are we headed toward this festival of partisan gerrymandering that Paul Smith warned about when he argued Rucho before the Supreme Court? What kind of reforms would you suggest to create a fairer process? I have so many questions I want to ask. I have to put about 5 into
sure
each one.
Festival. Whew, that is not a word I'd use. It's much too sunny. I lot of good questions. A lot is happening. You mentioned I mentioned Wisconsin before, and I think it is worth keeping an eye on other states with GOP legislatures, GOP controlled legislatures and Democratic governors to see if there are other attempts to undermine the governor's influence and power over redistricting. You could see it in Pennsylvania, but you still have the Supreme Court there as a backstop. So I'm less worried about that. Very worried about Wisconsin. Yeah, it's all very bad. And you mentioned the census. The census is an interesting wrinkle this time around because I recall, I believe it was, I want to say it was December 20th or 22nd in 2010 is what we call redistrictment. So we all found out what reapportionment was for the coming decade, the last decade now. And of course, that was when a census was done properly. And this one has been a disaster. And because of that, legislators in Virginia are going to be running on probably the same lines that they got out of the last court decision there, as opposed to new lines redrawn by a new commission, because primaries are in June, this coming June, in January, because every year is an election year in Virginia, because state officials are elected in off years. So, but things will probably be, hopefully, maybe be ready in terms of the data in time for congressional elections, which means that Republicans in these states where they run things in terms of redistricting, which is most states, they will be in overdrive to get these maps drawn and rammed through their legislatures so they can be in play. So, yeah, but you did mention some Democratic states, and I know there is some buzz about New York right now in terms of Democrats moving there to push back on the commission process there. And some folks are using this as fodder for like, oh, Democrats aren't very committed to actual redistricting reform. I would dispute that. I would say that we are already in this round of redistricting. It has started. This process is underway. Look at like commission's already been selected in Colorado, and sorry, in Arizona and Virginia, places like that. So this is the playing field as it is. And Democrats have to play on this field as well. They have to deal with the situation as it exists right now. And there is very little meaningful redistricting reform out there at the state level, and obviously none at the federal level. So asking Democrats to unilaterally disarm to give Republicans an unearned artificial majority in Congress for who knows how many cycles after this round of redistricting is, well, to expect Democrats to do that would be political malpractice on their part. Why should Republicans win the game without Democrats playing at all, just because they're better at gaming the system and they have resisted reform at every turn? Democrats have a very small majority in Congress as it is, and that majority can be easily overwhelmed just by partisan gerrymandering. It's really that simple. So expecting Democrats to sit back and do nothing is unfair. After this round of redistricting, everyone should push very hard for reform at every level, including the federal level. But this time around, let's keep Republicans from completely disenfranchising millions of Democrats around the nation. And I guess the last word is a lot of people aren't really talking about Iowa. Everyone's like, oh, Iowa has this commission. It's traditionally a very fair redistricting state. It's not going to be this time. Republicans in the state are prepared and ready and raring to ignore the recommendations of that commission and redraw the map any way they want. And they're allowed to by current state law. They could pass new laws to rig it even further, but they don't even have to. Just because they have complete power there for the first time in many, many decades, they're going to rig it 8 ways to Sunday. So again, all bad news. I'm so sorry.
It's a beautiful spring day, at least here in Western Massachusetts. It can't be all bad, right? Yeah. Reform talk is underway, though. And Michael, I know we share a sense that redistricting is a problem, but that the root cause of so much polarization and unrepresentativeness in our politics are these single member winner takes all districts themselves, and that you, like all of us at FairVote, have urged Congress to pass the Fair Representation Act, which would establish a more proportional system of representation through multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, which hands voters the power to elect a broader and more diverse set of representatives. Wondering why you view the Fair Representation Act as a most complete approach to fixing the problem of redistricting, especially why in this moment of polarization and of this moment of assaults at the Capitol, you would see it as the strongest solution.
Yeah, I don't mean to sound alarmist, and I can't get on board with either party trying to use its partisan advantage. Though I'm sensitive to Carolyn's point, but if the prospects of an anti-democratic faction, Dave, you alluded to the attack on the Capitol, the prospects of them retaking the House and the Senate in 2 years through a combination of gerrymandering, voter suppression, with restrictive election laws, and white nationalism, if they're as high as I believe they are, then multi-member districts may be our best hope of getting out of this bipolar cycle that Carolyn just alluded to. The For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, these are crucial pieces of legislation in their own right. But we have to decide eventually, I think, as a country, whether once again we're going to allow white nationalism to play the role of a pivotal coalition, just as segregationist Democrats did for generations, thwarting free and fair elections, or we're finally going to institute an electoral scheme that will cordon off these forces from political power without destroying our own democracy, but still preventing the kind of democratic backsliding that we saw at the end of Reconstruction, because frankly, that's what we're seeing now across the states, the largest effort at voter suppression that we've seen in this country really since the end of Reconstruction. And I'm not saying that any but the most extreme nationalists want to take back to pre-1965 days, but the fact is, it's clear that we're stuck in a zero-sum game. In a two-party system, when mobilizing supporters is not sufficient to win seats, suppressing or diluting the votes of your opponents may be the only route to victory. So increasing support, putting in support for voter suppression, this is a reflection of this internal ideological and practical constraints that we face with the two-party system. 30 years ago, now Harvard professor Lonnie Guinier warned us about this. She was concerned about the capacity of achieving Black representation electorally, also allowing adjacent districts and other coalitions in Congress to ignore the interest of underrepresented voters. And we've got to do something about that. Representation means more than just electoral success. And I think the Fair Representation Act, while it may need some work, it may be our only way of getting there.
Carl, I just want to put a similar question to you. I know More Equitable Democracy has backed the FRA. How do you see all these pieces of legislation working together? You mentioned the For the People Act, also the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, strengthening and returning those important preclearance provisions that got stripped by the court in Shelby County. But how do you also see the Fair Representation Act fitting into this picture? And how might a move away from single member districts help communities of color amplify their voice and build political power?
Well, the way that I understand it, and if any of the panelists want to jump in and set me straight, is that the FRA, the Fair Rep Act, it applies only to Congress, but it has this component of using multi-member districts to elect people to Congress, and that's great. We need that. Communities of color, we need that because, as I understand it, if communities of color are 1/6 of the population in a state, they can now win a congressional district versus winner take all. We're essentially screwed if our population sizes are too small to reach the threshold to secure representation. Now, the the reason I brought up the John Lewis Voting Rights Act earlier, and Michael, I totally agree with what you were saying, and I'm so happy that you brought up Lonnie Guinier because she's a personal hero of mine, and her thoughts and theories resonate with Emmy Dean. We get a lot of our perspectives directly from her. But the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would apply to Congress and all the political subdivisions. So these political subdivisions include states, cities, municipality entities. And so that would actually bring this idea of proportional representation down to the local level where people can actively get engaged. And listen, our electoral system, it was rooted in the politics of exclusion, right? From the very beginning. If you weren't wealthy, white, land owning, if you, literate, if you weren't any of those things, you could not participate in democracy. Now we've slowly added the right to vote and expanded that franchise. Well, I wouldn't say, I guess I'd say that we won through like blood, sweat, and tears, but we're still essentially operating in these politics of exclusion. And it's not, it's obvious, like just look around you, the number of crises that our communities are facing, that we are not well equipped to address these issues because we don't have a seat at the table. Our voices are essentially silenced in these winner-take-all elections, and it's screwing everything up. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, I think, is fantastic. We absolutely need it to bring that level of proportional, or bring proportional representation to the local municipal level where people can actually get engaged with it. The FRA, desperately needed for Congress. There was something else I was going to say about HR 1. Oh yeah, HR 1, the efforts to rein in these out of control gerrymandering tactics. If HR 1 were to pass tomorrow, those remedies wouldn't take place until what, 2030? Is that how I understand it? And so it's HR 1, a lot of good stuff in there. We definitely need it. FRA, good for Congress. But the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, I think that we need to spend a lot of time talking about this and seriously considering how this empowers communities of color and how it tackles the white supremacist electoral system that we have head on. And when we attack white supremacy in America, it makes everyone's lives better.
I want to open the floor to questions. We've got a lot of them down there. Another reminder to drop yours into either the boxes below. Emily and the rest of our FairVote team is watching those, and they're trying to send them on to us. A bunch of questions about democratic gerrymanders. Michael, let me throw this to you as someone who has studied this cycle after cycle. Unfortunately, both parties play this game quite well for our detriment. Is a comment that we've heard from a couple folks. There's some mentions of Maryland and John Sarbanes' district being one of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. Certainly Democrats did a pretty good job turning that state inside out in the last cycle. What does your research show on the partisanship of this process? And are there notable examples of Democrats playing this same down and dirty game?
Sure. The short answer is that parties are going to party, right? They're going to work with the incentives that they have. And so Maryland's an example of a congressional Democratic gerrymander. Hawaii and a handful of other state legislatures are gerrymandered in favor of the Democratic Party. But there are different dynamics at work. And the most fundamental of which is that over the last 20, 30 years, it's been easier for Republicans to gerrymander than Democrats. And the reason for that is that due to the increasing urban-rural divide, Democrats tend to be concentrated geographically in cities and urban areas. So it's easier for Republicans in control of the process to pack them into districts where they're wasting more votes, or to give them what we call a sink district, where you're sinking your opposition's votes. It's been more difficult for Democrats to do that because Republicans tend to be allocated geographically more efficiently. And so again, this gets back to the problem that this is a fundamental feature of single member districts. And even in a state like California, where the redistricting commission did a great job in 2010, it was a pretty deliberative, citizen forward process, and it produced a fair map. It also still produced a map that was quite responsive. And by that, I mean the vote to seat ratio. Democrats had a big advantage in terms of the percentage of seats that they won compared to the percentages of votes that they won, not because it was a gerrymandered plan, but because single member districts always give a bonus to the largest party, right? And you can think about this just in terms of, if we made all 53 congressional districts in California a microcosm of the state, Democrats would win every seat. Not because of gerrymandering, but because that's a function of single member districts. And that's why I think we've got to look more closely at some of these other reforms in multi-member districts in particular.
I see at least one member of the California Commission on our attendee list. So hello to you and welcome. Perhaps there are more. I think you make a really important point there as well. And I mean, from sitting here in Massachusetts, another state in which there are, certainly plenty of Republicans, but there has not been a Republican elected to the U.S. House here since 1994. And if you were able to do, multi-member districts and a single transferable vote and elect people in a proportional fashion, you might have New England Republicans represented again. I mean, in a state like Kansas or Oklahoma, you might see, Midwestern Democrats again, and single member districts really, shuts that out.
You raise a really important point. A lot of folks, including myself, have tried to draw maps in Massachusetts to get where you could see Republicans get elected, and it's virtually impossible to do. It's very difficult to do because of the way that Republicans are distributed. And you're right. I mean, moving to multi-member districts would do more than just actually give people voting equality. It would, to your point, it would allow more rural Democrats to be elected. It would allow more urban Republicans to be elected. And so it would affect the composition of the party system as well.
And I would just throw this out there as well, is that it would open up opportunities for third parties to actually get into office. If you're using ranked choice voting in single member districts, it doesn't really offer third parties who might be a numerical minority a true path to representation. The true path to representation can only happen within, well, maybe not only, but like one of the best ways is through these multi-member districts using single transferable vote. And if we're able to get a better balance of parties in the US, then it does become less of a zero-sum game. And we really get to negotiate those big questions about who gets what in a democracy, who gets fair, who gets racial justice, who gets fair criminal justice, who gets clean water, who gets to decide who becomes a citizen, who decides reparations, who decides how our taxes go to fund single-payer healthcare systems. All these big questions that we need to address right now, they cannot happen under a single member district because it leads to this duopoly zero-sum game. And so those are the really big ideas that we need to be addressing right now.
Question from Jay, who says, Carlos makes a very important point. How do you draw districts that maximize the impact of every individual vote rather than simply engineer it to ensure representation by some nominal underrepresented group? And wonders how you define underrepresented. Is it by race, ethnicity, age, or by socioeconomic status, regardless of the above? And how do you protect the minority while respecting majority opinion?
Is that a question for me?
I think it is.
How do we
I think
define
it is.
Well, I think I'd like to take a step back real quick and to think about like elections. And I like to think about elections as a wall. Okay. And so on the other side of the wall is representation. And let's say I come from a community of color that is 20% of the population where I'm at. In order for my community to get representation, then we have to exceed 50%, right? That threshold in order to overcome the wall and get to the other side of representation. But you can't do that in a single member district using winner take all systems because the threshold is 50%. If you're a community of interest smaller than 50%, there's no way that you're going to overcome that wall. And so what you have to do, well, there are a couple ways. One is luck. Like if the entire field is flooded with candidates and everyone splits the vote, then maybe you'll squeak by, right? Maybe you'll squeak by, you'll get representation. Or you have to create your own single member district, which relies on segregation, right? To create these majority minority districts, it relies on segregation, and there's no place in the US, in our culture, that values segregation. It's a thing of the past. It may have gotten us, so far since the civil rights movement, creating single member districts, increasing representation for Black and brown people. It's gotten us to a point, but it can only take us so far. And so we need to think about like other ways on how to expand the right of representation to more people. I don't think I answered that person's question fully because I don't have the vocabulary to particularly define what is a minority representation. So,
David, I have a real precise answer to that question, and that's simply to make everyone's vote weighted exactly the same. And there's only one system that does that, and it's the equivalent of list proportional representation. So not by gerrymandering or geography, but by simple mathematical logic, the only system that grants everyone an equally weighted vote is if everyone's vote counts equally towards the percentage of seats that they get, and only PR does that.
A couple of questions about HR 1. One suggestion that while it appears unlikely to pass, barring reform of the filibuster, what might prevent future Congresses or Republican president from changing those provisions legislatively? Another similar question, wondering if it might be able to be struck down in part or in whole in the courts. Carolyn, any sense on what might happen if as you suggest, Republicans take Congress in 2022, or if a Republican president's elected in 2024?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad someone brought up the courts, because I think before we have to worry about Republican lawmakers rolling something like HR 1 back, we have to worry about the courts. We might reform the filibuster, we might get it passed, but if we do, it's on borrowed time given recent decisions by the current court. It's very hostile to this kind of thing, and I don't expect it to last very long. That said, if it were to survive and we did get still a Republican Senate, Republican president, Republican House, once you have given people more rights, once you have made voting easier, it is hard to take things away from people once you've given them to people. Republicans will want to get rid of it, but the optics for them will be very, very bad. The politics will be very, very difficult. So that's not saying they won't do it, because to a point, they don't care, as they've demonstrated again and again over the course of the past decade. However, getting HR 1, making it that law, getting it passed, getting it in place is an important place to start. Whether it's, the courts overrule it and now we have a new spotlight on Supreme Court reform or expansion. That is something that is not a part of this conversation specifically, but kind of has to be when we're talking about passing HR1 and leaving it in place. But I'm more worried about the courts than I am about future Republican Congresses getting rid of it. Although that is absolutely something worth worth fearing. But again, once you've given people these rights and made the process more fair, it is challenging to undermine that.
Try to keep an eye on these questions as they are coming in here. Michael, you were in California, and I believe Carlos, you're probably on the West Coast as well.
I'm in Memphis, Tennessee, David.
Are
This
you?
is the
I
9th
thought More Equitable
congressional district.
Democracy. See, I'm so wrong.
Right
Well,
here. The Mississippi River is just flowing right over there.
I mean, that's a coast,
You're right
arguably.
there.
It is a coast.
There was a question about recommendations for a strategy in California. Well, I'm not really. Let me go to another. Let me take another look at that question as I try to understand exactly. I think I missed a lower comment on that. Why don't we try to jump back into the For the People Act for just a second? The redistricting provisions, there's been some back and forth, right? As far as whether these are going to be in place possibly for this next cycle or whether they would wait until 2030. Does anybody know exactly what the latest is on when these provisions would kick in? And is there a chance that the House bill is talking about one thing and the Senate could perhaps drop in 2030 or 2020, and then this would have to be worked out in conference?
Yeah, I mean, hearings have just begun on the Senate version of the bill. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. A number of folks have pointed out the work that needs to be done on this bill. I mean, you have to remember it's a pretty giant omnibus voting rights bill, right? There are pieces of it that have been taken from other legislation, and there are dates. Jessica Huseman wrote a piece pretty critical of this from a election administrative sort of perspective. And I think we need to listen to those critiques, and clearly there'll be some changes in the Senate that are going to be different than the House bill. And so there will be some form of reconciliation that needs to take place. So I don't know I mean, we should be pointing out these problems because it is a crucial piece of legislation, but I think that changes will come.
Question from John Fixdahl, which I'll pose to all three of you or anybody who'd like to jump in. Is there a tension between nonpartisan redistricting's purported randomness and a desire for a specific outcome, as in a reduction of single party dominance or greater fairness?
I can quickly address that. What we found in our research is that rule-based districting criteria, compactness, or protecting incumbents, or just saying that a map has to be fair, doesn't work nearly as well as procedural requirements put into place. What really counts is when you take redistricting out of the hands of legislators. Once you do that, once you separate the process from the political process, you get better maps.
There's a new question about trends in anti-gerrymandering initiatives brought under state constitutions in state courts. Carolyn, there were fair maps, one in Pennsylvania and then in North Carolina, right?
I would dispute the fairness of the new maps in North Carolina.
The state courts, however, stepped in on previous maps there. Is that a road forward in other states?
I think to best sort of illustrate how this is not a cure-all in terms of a road forward, we need to look back to Florida. Florida has the Fair Districts Amendments that are enforced by the state Supreme Court, which is dominated by conservatives. So you end up with fair maps that aren't really very fair. And then you have a situation like North Carolina that redrew maps ostensibly more fairly, but they ended up, if you look at the math, they ended up just as skewed towards Republicans as the previous maps were. And Michael's points were great, especially when you talk about like taking it away from legislators versus like, compactness and all that. Like it's hard to kind of look at a state unless you're really familiar with it and kind of know what a community of interest is in that state. It might defy it might run along like a river. And so it might be long and windy and look weird, but it might be like a really good congressional or state legislative district. So, and given that many state courts are dominated by conservatives, because again, not part of this conversation, but I could go on at length about how Democrats have dropped the ball in terms of spending money on electing progressives and Democrats to state courts, but they are mostly dominated by conservatives. And while a lot of states do have sort of fairness provisions in terms of districts or elections and things like that, they're all not going to work out the way they did in Pennsylvania, because the state court is the final say, and they get to decide what that means.
A very important question from Michael. Where can I acquire your Gerrymandering in America book? I didn't find it on the UCS website. Also, do you have a more recent report available, which sounds to me like a wonderful opportunity to talk about your forthcoming book?
An effort for me to pitch my new book. Yeah, we do. Actually, we have where we are not as creative as David Daley in our titles. So Gerrymandering in America, pretty sterile. The sequel to Gerrymandering in America is Gerrymandering the States. And that will be available, we hope, in July or August. And both of those are available at Cambridge University Press.
I sold RADEFT as Gerrymandered Nation. So I was right there with you in the boring title, and my publisher said, no, you're not allowed to do that. So
well, I obviously
my mom would know I had a book if I had your publisher. Is there any possibility of Congress to define a criteria for what constitutes an illegal gerrymander, since that appears to be one thing that is causing the Supreme Court from declaring a map gerrymandered? Anybody interested in popping in on that one?
I think it's a really interesting question, and
Yeah,
both Carolyn and Carlos might be able to answer this better than I, but my sense is there's two ways to go about it, right? There's rule-based and procedure-based. So you could either write a law that says districting plans will not be biased, right? You just forbid it on the front, or you create an independent redistricting commission. You require, as most of the world's democracies do, to have the process done by professional administrators rather than partisans, and that's probably my preference.
In Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, she mentions how the private prison and prison industrial complex participates in gerrymandering through constructions of prisons within rural areas, with inmates automatically becoming citizens of that state. How can this be changed, and what role does the government have in combating this? Should future legislation specifically target this issue? I believe prison gerrymandering is part of HR 1, if I'm right. Prison gerrymandering is one of the more insidious forms. Any of you interested in taking this on, who have a special interest in?
I would just note that it's being dealt with in sort of a very piecemeal way at the state level. So it is on lawmakers' minds, on reformers' minds, at the level of government at which these maps are drawn. But it is one of those things that, while sort of prescribing how to do fair redistricting at the federal level is complicated and challenging, I feel like that's a really straightforward way to take a real bit of rat effing out of the process.
I will always be grateful for a plug of my work. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here. This was a really lively hour. I can't believe it is over already. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Emily and everybody on the FairVote side making this run so well, to all of you in the audience for all of your great questions. Once again, I am going to plug Michael's new book, Gerrymandering the States, which will be available over the summer. Before then, you should get Gerrymandering in America. You should be subscribed to Carolyn's newsletter. You ought to be following More Equitable Democracy on social media, and you certainly ought to be tuning into our next webinar, The Electoral Reform Imperative to Address Our Polarization Crisis, which is Wednesday, April 14th. Also a West Coast friendly happy hour, East Coast friendly 4 p.m. start Eastern time. So 1 p.m. out there. You can go to fairvote.org/2021_webinar_series for more information, or just go to our website, fairvote.org. It is all up there. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at an event down the road.